All right, and we're back after a short break with Bas Vodde. So we had previously Jürgen, who was the author of Management 3.0. We had Marina, who is the creator of Sales with Agile Framework. And today we have also Bas Vodde, one of the co-creators or co-inventors of the Large Scale Scrum Framework, LeSS. I'm super excited to have Bas here as a member of our broader Scrum community, as a thought leader in that community. Bas, I hand over to you. Everyone enjoy the session with Bas.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm not very used to speaking remotely yet, so I'll do my best. I believe I have 30 minutes time for a 50-minute presentation, so that's going to be squeezing it a little bit, and then there will be about 20 minutes time for questions still. So the topic that I'd like to talk about today is a presentation I've been doing quite a lot, so I'm comfortable with that presentation itself. It's called The Story of LeSS, and I'll explain during the presentation a little bit on why it's called this. First, a brief agenda. I'll be talking about Scrum for 3 minutes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about LeSS. And then the majority of this presentation is about why LeSS. Why was it created? Why does it work the way it works? Because if you want to understand LeSS, the framework itself is pretty easy to understand, and it is much more important to understand the reasoning behind it and where it came from. So, agenda point 1, Scrum. Whenever people talk about Scrum, they tend to talk about or show this a picture that looks like this, the sometimes referred to as the Scrum process or the Scrum flow. And it's true that this picture reflects Scrum. However, to me, this is probably the least interesting view, the least interesting perspective of Scrum, because Scrum has a lot of different views, ways of looking at Scrum. So, for example, to me, this is a better overview of Scrum than the previous one. It shows pictures of the key concepts. Scrum is very team-based. It's about cross-functional teams. It's about setting them free, letting them manage themselves. And it's about iteratively, incrementally building up a product and coming up with a solution to a problem for customers and users. Now, this is another perspective of Scrum, one that rarely gets talked about, and that is organizationally, if you adopt a Scrum well, then probably it's going to lead to destruction of functional groups and functional departments. In fact, I've learned over using Scrum for now nearly 20 years that whenever that is not happening, whenever the functional departments stay, then probably that will lead to certain problems within your organization. But rarely is this perspective of Scrum talked about. But then a good question, especially thinking about scaling, is what is the essence of Scrum? Because once we want to apply Scrum not to one team, but to multiple teams, then we'd like to not scale up a process, but we'd like to scale up an essence. We'd like to achieve the same goal as Scrum. So what is that essence of Scrum? Now, to me, the essence of Scrum is this very simple idea of getting a cross-functional group of people, letting them directly interact with a person who has a problem, a customer, a user. Together, they discuss that problem to try to understand it further. They come up with something to build, something to try out that might solve that problem. And the cross-functional team goes off and builds that for a fixed short time period. They get together again, they look at what was built, they think about how they build it, They discuss what's the next most important problem to solve. They build something, they stop, they look at what they build, they look at how they build it, and based on that, etc., etc., etc. And it's that dynamic that is the most important part of Scrum, and it's that dynamic that we want to have, not with a single team, but with multiple teams once we start scaling up. Agenda point 2, less consists of different perspectives too, and just like Scrum, the most common one that you'll probably see is this picture, which is, I guess, the less flow or the less framework. And just like Scrum, it's an important view, an important perspective, but it's not the most important perspective. But I'll run through this very, very briefly because it's easy to understand. So in LeSS, we have always one product owner, no matter how many teams, no matter what product, you always have one product owner and one product backlog. After that, we'll start with sprint planning. Sprint planning up to 8 teams will be shared between all of the teams. Sprint planning consists of 1 and 2. 1 is where the teams select the items from the product backlog, and 2 is where the individual teams separately from each other are working on the items that are working out the items that their team is going to work on during this sprint. Sprint planning 2 is usually done together with all of the teams in one room. It's kind of like an individual event per team, but then done together in the same space. All of the teams work within the same one sprint, and at the end of the sprint, there will be only one integrated shippable product. We have one shared sprint review across the teams. However, the retrospective then is per team, and then at the end, there's still the only added event in LeSS over Scrum, an overall retrospective where the management, product owners, Scrum Masters, and representative of teams, or sometimes all of the teams, all of the team members get together and they look at the systemic organizational problems and improvement opportunities. Now, as I mentioned, this is an overview of LeSS. The LeSS framework itself, it's very easy to understand this framework, but once you understand that framework, you don't really understand LeSS yet. So to understand LeSS better, we'll need to dive a bit more in the history. And there actually, this talk has its origin in another talk that I did a couple of years ago in the Agile Singapore conference, where I used to live up to 3 weeks ago. And in that talk, I did an overview of LeSS. And it was the typical overview of a process framework where, just like now, I went over all of the different elements, however, in a little bit more detail. And I thought it went pretty well. I think it's also videoed, so you should be able to find that. I thought it went pretty well. And then I asked one of my colleagues at the end, I asked him, what did you think about it? And he looked at me and he said, I think it was boring. And I was shocked. And then he said, but don't worry. Every talk about a framework will be boring. So I picked that up as a challenge, and I thought about how can I make an introduction talk to a framework without it being boring. And that's this talk. And therefore, the rest of the talk, the rest of the 20 minutes that I have left, I'll be talking a little bit about the background and the story of how LeSS got created. Because you understand less best once you understand how and why it was created. Now, before I get to that, I'd like to share just a funny little story that I've come to appreciate and think is important, and it relates to the not the two white guys in the picture, but the other one, which is my oldest son, as you can see, a Star Wars fan, and I always have a lot of conversations with him because children have a wonderful mind and do not yet have a lot of assumptions. So a couple of years ago, I was with him driving back from his swimming lessons, and we're sitting in the car, and this was in Singapore, and we're stuck in traffic, and he's sitting in the back, and he's getting annoyed that we're not going fast enough. So he's looking at me and he says, "Papa, I want to go faster." And I said to him, "Well, that's very nice, but as you can see, we have all these cars in front of us. Our car cannot fly, and we'll be stuck in traffic. We won't be going any faster." But then he looked at the other side of the road and he said, "But they are going faster because there's no traffic on the other side of the road." And I said to him, "Yes, they're going faster. However, they're going in the wrong direction." Right? So we have a choice here. What would you like to do? Would you like to go very fast in the wrong direction? Or would you like to go a little bit slower in the right direction? And he thought about it for a bit, and then he said, "I would like to go very fast in the wrong direction." And at that point, I just thought it was funny. But then the next day, I reflected a little bit on this conversation, and I realized that it's probably a good summary of what happens in our industry. A lot of companies that I work with are obsessed with going fast, and they're much less interested on whether they're going in the right direction. So unless we'd like to focus on the right direction more than productivity and efficiency and things like that, because that's not, in our opinion, the basics, essence of agile development anyway. Okay, now the story of LeSS, the creation story of LeSS, if you wish, starts with a company called Nokia. And then not the phone company called Nokia, but the network company called Nokia that is now still called Nokia. And it didn't start with the product that you see on the presentation, which is a 4th generation LTE base station. But instead, it started with a 3rd generation radio network controller. So I was personally working in Nokia and at the RNC development. And at that time, Nokia Networks decided, this was 2004, 2005, that they want to do agile development. They didn't really know what it was, but it was a hot new thing and they needed to do that. They looked into the company for somebody who had experience in that, and they found me. I was living in China, and I don't claim to be the only one that had experience in agile development in the company. I do claim to be the only findable one. And that was from my pre-Nokia time when we were applying extreme programming. Now, they asked, do you want to lead this agile change process project, towards agile change project towards agile development? I had said yes to that. Unfortunately, I had to move to Helsinki, Finland, and there I found a company that didn't really know what they wanted to do, and therefore the first thing that we did, I mean, related to agile development, the first thing that we did is we started looking for somebody that I could work with. And we found this person was Craig Larman. And we found him because he had written a book at the time, this book, Agile Iterative Development, a Manager's Guide. And this is one of the early Agile books. It's pretty good. And it was a wonderful summary of everything related to Agile development, a little bit. And that was perfect for a company that wanted to adopt something that they don't know what it is yet, so that they could get an overview and they could decide what they would like to actually do. So since then, I started working with Craig. That's been a long time now. It's been very nice. One of the things that he did is he would come in and would give an overview, 1 hour presentation of everything Agile development. Often there would be like 100 people coming there, and then afterwards we would ask them, what would you like to do? And the most common response was, well, this extreme programming is a little bit too extreme. We don't really want to do that, but this Scrum thing sounds really easy, so we want to do that. So a lot of products started adopting Scrum, which is when we also started working with Ken Schwaber, one of the creators or the creator of Scrum. Quickly, we discovered that we had two problems. The first problem was Scrum was created for a single team. And in Nokia networks, there were no products which were built by one team. The smallest product had about 3 teams on it, and the largest product, nobody had any idea how much teams worked on such a product. The second problem we had is that there were 1.5 coach available, and Craig had been too successful in convincing people to try out Agile development. And therefore, there were 10, 20 different products that wanted to try that out with only 1.5 coach available. So the only way to survive this was to do a lot of experiments. So what we would do is we would go to one of the products. We would spend 1-2 days pair programming with some of the developers to get a sense of what is going on in the development itself, right? Later, we sometimes would refer to this as going Gemba for a little bit to see the reality in how the product is getting created. And then after that, we would get a cross-functional group together, different kinds of management, developers, QA, project if they still had that, etc. We would get them into a room in a workshop, and in this workshop we would spend time understanding the current problems that they had within their organization, and then with that deeper understanding of their problems, we would come up with some experiments that they could try out. Then they would try that out, and me and Craig would go to the next product, spend a little bit hands-on with the developers, get a cross-functional group in the room, create an experiment, go to the next one. And then after about 2 weeks or so, we would come back to the first one and see what worked and see what didn't. We would drop the things that didn't work. First, analyze why it didn't work, and then change it or drop that. And we would try to learn from the things that worked, why they did work. And for about 2 years or so, we did lots and lots of different experimentations in parallel in different products. Now, how did we come up with the experiments? There are a couple of sources for influencing us with the experiments, but probably the most important ones were written books and articles about large-scale product development, because there's there was a lot written about what people had done. And two of the most influential ones were debugging the development process and dynamics of software development. Dynamics of software development is basically the story of how Visual C++ version 1 was created. And debugging the development process is the story of how Microsoft Excel version 1 was created. And especially for now, I'll focus on dynamics of software development, because in that we started finding, actually, let me take a step back. One of the other influences was this article, unfortunately, a very unknown article written by even Andre Carlson and Lars-Göran Andersson, who worked in Ericsson. And Ericsson was basically the main competitor of Nokia, and therefore them adopting extreme programming was of interest to this. Now, this article and the dynamics of software development together, both of these introduced this idea of feature teams, which is an essential part of LeSS nowadays. Now, I'm not going to dive into details of feature and component teams. I'll give a very, very brief introduction now. There is a lot more to learn about them. Most large products, when they start adopting agile development, they are structured around what we call component teams. And component teams means that teams own a particular part of the system. There's a map between the architecture and the org chart. So component teams very much relate to structure and also to ownership. Now, component teams lead to significant problems in development because customers request features that don't belong to individual components. And therefore, in order to implement end-to-end functionality, you actually need to work with multiple component teams, and you'll get dependencies. And dependencies seem like a problem. Nowadays, I don't consider dependencies to be a problem at all anymore. However, asynchronous dependencies are a problem. And asynchronous dependencies is when one team depends on another team, needs to work together with another team, but the other team has something else to do that for them is more important. And this leads to a conflict between the teams, where the teams asynchronously work on the same feature. One team 1 week, another team a month later, while they need to integrate their work. And that integration leads to lots of problems because they're not working on it at the same time. Now, there's a lot more to say about component teams and dependencies, but I'll leave that for now, for here. The alternative to this is a feature team structure. And in a feature team structure, you have teams that can potentially work on multiple components, and you give them a feature. And it's the team's responsibility to implement the entire feature independent on what component they will need to touch themselves. And therefore, there's no more dependencies between the teams related to the feature. The feature always belongs to one team. However, we have multiple teams now working on the same component. And in that sense, they still have a dependency, but that dependency is always what we refer to as a synchronous dependency, where two teams only have to collaborate together when they work at the same time at the same component. And these kind of dependencies are much easier and even probably even a good thing. So we started adopting feature teams first on these free team products, and it worked fine. And then we adopted it on 8 team, etc., etc. And it didn't matter what scale we adopted it. it always worked fine. And again, there's more to that. There's a reason why feature teams work well on virtually any scale, but it's unfortunately outside the scope of this short introduction. There will be more videos available about this, probably not in this conference. So I was in Finland doing experiments for 2 years. After 2 years, I decided that Finland is too cold and I want to migrate south again. I moved back to China first, later to Finland, where there's no winters ever. When I was in China, I rejoined the radio network controller, the RNC, which I talked about earlier, and we started changing that product to what we then just refer to as Large Scrum. At that point, Craig said to me, we should write a book. And I didn't know the answer to that should be no, because it's a very painful and long process. But he convinced me to do that. Eventually, that ended up with these 2 books, which were catalogs of our experiments. And they are, if I may say so, pretty good still. However, the feedback was interestingly mixed. And some people said these are excellent, some of the best books we've ever read. And some people said, these books were very interesting, but after reading 1,000 pages of experiments, I still don't know where to start with scaling up Agile development. Because at no point did we say when you're adopting Agile development on a multi-team scenario, this is what you must do, and this is what you must do. Instead, they were just, we tried this out, it worked. We tried that out, it didn't work, etc., etc. At first, we took this feedback and considered the people not smart enough to understand our book. Then reflecting on that a little bit, we realized that that is not the right way to respond to feedback. So instead, we started reflecting on it ourselves a little bit and ended up coming back to the Shu-Ha-Ri model, which is used quite frequently in Agile development. I believe introduced by Alistair Coburn in our industry, originated from Aikido. And it describes 3 levels of learning. Shu-Ha-Ri, Shu, beginner level, where you need instructions to follow. Ha, beginning expert, or expert beginner, where you learn which rules to break at times. And then Ri, master, expert, and you don't need rules to follow anymore. You come up with your own rules. Reflecting on the 2 books using the Shu-Ha-Ri, we realized the books were probably written on Ha-Ri level. The mistake we made is we wrote the books that we wanted to read at that time, and not something that somebody who gets introduced to Agile development needs to read, or gets introduced to, wants an introduction to Agile development at scale, needs to read. So we asked the question, should we create more prescription? Because that's what people are asking for. They're at the Shu level and they require some recipes, prescription, processes, something that says they need to do this. Now, we never had that, because whenever you give prescription to people, the worst thing that can happen is people actually follow that. And they stop thinking themselves. They just start following the process. And instead, we'd like to have people own their own process, own their own ways of working, reflect on how they need to work. And you don't get that with getting prescription. However, whenever people didn't start, they wouldn't have any ownership. So we had this conflict between prescription and ownership, and we thought about it a bit more, and then we realized that this conflict was basically solved already, and it was solved in Scrum itself. Scrum itself is very prescriptive. However, the prescription that it adds is at the reflection points. So it adds the prescription at the points where you generate reflection and where you then can take more ownership. So after that realization, we decided we'd like to create some prescription. We'd like to, if you wish, take the essential experiments out of our experiments so far, make them rules or prescription. But we want to have as little of them as possible, and they need to focus on increasing the reflection, increasing people's ownership of how they work. So we created what we now call the LeSS rules, which is, this is a snapshot of one of the first versions, which is 3 pages of things that we consider that any organization scaling up agile development ought to be doing. And I'm not going over the rules right now, but it's only 3 pages, and if we improve on them, improvements would be to remove from it and not to add more to it, because we don't want to take the organization's ownership of how they work away. The teams, the organization need to themselves continuously reflect on their problems and create experiments. Craig said, let's write another book. And I said, no, I had enough of that. He convinced me to do it anyway, because this was going to be quick. Fortunately, it took still, I think, 2 or 3 years to write. And this Large Scale Scrum book is a prequel to the other ones. It describes the LeSS rules and the impact that the rules have on an organization. Sometimes we refer to the impact that you can expect, what you can expect when you adopt the LeSS rules to an organization. We describe them also as guides. And taking all of these things together, we created a view of LeSS, a perspective of LeSS, if you wish, that we appreciate most, which is the biggest view, the biggest content of LeSS is experiments and an experimental mindset, a mindset to own how you work, constantly reflect on that and try out new things. And also share your experiences with each other using experiments. And experiments are not best practices. Instead, they describe a particular problem in a particular context, and then describe the experience that a person has trying to solve that particular problem without a guarantee that the same experience is repeatable in other places. Then we have the framework or rules, which is, if you wish, the prescriptive bit of LeSS that focuses on structure and focuses on reflection. The guides explain the effect you can expect in an organization once you start applying the rules. And then we extracted 12 principles out of the experiments, 10 principles out of the experiments, which we consider the input for experimentation. And these are the 10 LeSS principles. And that's, if you wish, at the core, at the heart of the LeSS framework. Now, I would like to end this talk with kind of going back to how I started looking at Scrum. LeSS is in a way similar as Scrum, in which it has all these different perspectives. We have the perspective that people will probably encounter first, which is the LeSS framework or the LeSS flow. The perspective that I just shared, which we refer to as the less complete picture, which is the experiments, guides, frameworks, and principles. Then LeSS has a strong focus on organizational structure. And therefore, another perspective of LeSS is the structural part. The experimentation is really core in LeSS, where we would like an organization to constantly reflect on what they're doing and creating experiments, trying out new things. The more with less principle, which I'm unfortunately not have time to go into, is probably the most important principle, where it realizes the harm that additional processes and roles can do to organizations. And we would like to have the same free autonomous teams like we can get in Scrum. We would like to have that same self-management and ownership in the team. And with that, I think I'll stop this presentation because there were some questions.
Yes.
Are there some questions?
Yes, Bas, there are some questions, and I think one of them is your favorite question. If you don't mind, stop sharing your presentation, then everyone will see the two of us larger engaging in that conversation.
Ooh, I do not know if I want to see the two of us larger.
So while you're doing that,
there we go.
Nikta is asking a question that you probably get a lot, and I'm not even sure if I had asked that question earlier, which is, what is your opinion on SAFe? And I think you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but if you can give maybe like a broad comparison between those two from your perspective, might be interesting for everyone here.
Well, I'm happy that SAFe exists, because it is the exact opposite of LeSS in virtually every way. And therefore, it makes it easier to explain LeSS.
Yeah. So you basically go and say it's the exact opposite of SAFe, and then...
well, you can explain that, because the amount of unnecessary complexity that SAFe has introduced in organizations, hierarchy, processes, roles, it is terrible, and I would wish it never on any developer.
On any development, on any organization.
On any organization. There's, you know, and I don't say that because I've created another scaling framework, because there's, you know, proper scaling frameworks. Nexus is a decent one if you don't like LeSS. But SAFe is just truly awful, and I would recommend people to never use it.
All right.
Is that enough of an opinion?
I think that's enough of an opinion, and a strong opinion. So putting SAFe aside, let's deep dive on LeSS. Now, Nikta, the same person, is asking a very specific question.
Okay.
And I know you have an answer for this. How to transform component teams to feature teams? And most likely it's a bit broader than this, but I'm happy to take your take on this.
Well, you know, it is both extremely simple and extremely complicated, right? It's extremely simple because basically, since you're not going to have new people, and you will be working with the people you have right now, and the change from component to feature teams is mostly about learning and skill. Therefore, roughly the two choices you have is restructure your teams into feature teams, or use your existing teams and accept the significant amount of learning that the existing teams will need to do. Now, in practice, it goes somewhere in between that, and depending on the scale of your product, there's different approaches to that. Like if you have 3 teams, then basically you get the teams in a room and you say, hey, we're going to do this for this reason, form new teams, go, and you're done. If you have 2,000 people or so, or one of the LeSS options is 6,000 people, you're not going to get them in a room. And the change from component to feature teams is a very long process. And therefore, you'll end up with lots of grays in between, because as I explained it just now, component feature team is a black and white concept. But once you start learning and adopting these concepts, you'll notice that they're not so black and white. There's a lot of gray in between.
So from your training many years ago, and there was a module on this specific thing, you had some kind of a map that
Yes.
we used. What was the name of that again?
That's called a feature team adoption map.
Adoption map, exactly.
Yes.
Would you mind like sharing any link later in the chat for people that are interested in looking at that map? Do you have something about that?
I think so, although it is still an under-documented concept. As in it's often verbally shared between people who experienced it, and I think the descriptions of it kind of suck. And I should use my time at home to write a much better description. But I'll try to.
I remember the conversations we had back then in the training around that map, and that actually documented the way a component team could transform to become a feature team. And I personally found it to be a very effective and powerful tool.
Yes, and since you joined, it has improved greatly.
I can imagine.
Since I'm now in Europe, this is kind of a hint that you ought to rejoin sometime again.
I will do that. I will do that. So some others are asking, less with more with less also says it reduces a lot of hierarchy in organizations, right? Now I have 2 questions.
Not necessarily. It reduces complexity, not necessarily hierarchy. Those are 2 different things.
So, and that's good. So one thing that I can't pronounce his name, it's difficult, but someone is asking, this may scare middle management and bring natural resistance. Mm-hmm. Now, how would you deal with that resistance? How would you deal with this? One is maybe saying that not necessarily there is less hierarchy, but please continue and answer or support that question.
There does tend to be a change in virtually every role, and some of those will disappear. Mm-hmm. Now, let me think about how to structure my words. And this sounds weird, but when adopting less, your goal should never be to adopt less. Right? You're working in an organization, and the purpose of the product development part of the organization is to build a product, and it's not to adopt a scaling framework. Right? So therefore, whenever I work with an organization, now it's a little bit different because the popularity of LeSS has dramatically increased. But whenever I work with an organization, I try not to focus on LeSS, but I try to focus on creating a better understanding of the problems that the organization has in development, which often relates to, for example, trying to get middle management to better understand the problems that are actually happening in teams rather than focusing on tools and reports and things like that. Now, with that better understanding, they might end up adopting less as a way that would resolve some of the existing problems within their organization. If they adopt something else, of course, that's fine, because in the end, it should be the organization that owns the way they work. They shouldn't buy a process framework and force that on an organization. But my experience has been, and of course I'm very biased, is that once the management truly gets a deeper understanding of the problems in an organization, it's not hard to convince them of the benefits they get from that deeper understanding. Then they come to see that some of the rules in LeSS help with these problems, and they kind of automatically move there. Okay. I always wish they would move somewhere else so that I personally get more learning.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about the role of the leader basically changing, right? Instead of looking at tools and reports, they would have to engage maybe more with the teams, think about how to remove some of the impediments that those teams are facing, creating an environment for each of those self-managed teams to grow and become better. Is there a specific leadership model that you would put behind that?
What do you mean with leadership model? Can you give some examples?
Yes, I mean, there are many different types of leadership models out there. For example, if you go back to the 1980s, 1990s, Jim Collins had the concept of level 5 leaders. Today, Bill Joyner has the concept, the leadership agility framework with expert, achiever, and catalyst leaders. Is there any specific type of leadership style that comes to your mind that would be much better compatible with within a LeSS organization compared to others?
I mean, the obvious answer would be yes, but I'm going to keep it with no, because that seems like the less obvious answer. I mean, there's obviously some leadership styles that are completely incompatible with LeSS, such as micromanagement and management by objectives, etc. All the other ones, I don't know. There's been so much leadership models that have passed by. I kind of lost a bit of interest in that side, and more interested in what the people themselves would like to do, have them reflect on their situation, and have them actually go to the place of work and try to really truly understand the problems that are there. So any model that kind of has those elements in it, and many of them do, would work.
Okay.
On the management side, LeSS is very much influenced by the lean way of thinking about management, and then specifically the Toyota way of thinking about management. Like if you want to become a LeSS trainer, there's a bunch of mandatory reading that you need to do, and one of those is workplace management. Taiichi Ono, one of the creators of the creator of the Toyota production system, because it's a very thin book, but it explains this weird way of thinking that he seemed to have pretty well.
Yeah. All right.
Does that answer? Do you think that answers it?
Yeah, it definitely answers my question in this case. I can think of several management models that would be more compatible with LeSS than others are. And I was also thinking about the lean way of managing, especially related to Toyota and Taiichi Ono. So that's a good answer from my perspective.
Okay.
So Bas, we're at the end of our time box. It was a pleasure to host you, to learn more about the history behind LeSS and your personal history. I remembered also the story with your son going from the swimming lesson, and then I want to go fast. I tell that story in my trainings, and every time everyone laughs a lot about it. So thanks for sharing that today as well. We go now into a 40-minute break. The next session is at the top of the hour,
Okay.
6 p.m. here, Central European summertime. And yes, again, thank you very much, Bas.
Bye.